Alrighty, hello everyone. My name is Gus Gerlach, and today I'm going to be doing a round analysis on the Minneapolis final round from 2019. Idzy Dyna MZ on the AF, speaking first, versus Blake PS on the neg, speaking second. The resolution is resolve the benefits of the United States federal government's use of offensive cyber operations outweigh the harms. I'll be flowing on Flexel here, which is a useful program, I think, to flow on my computer. Follow along with me, and also you should try to be flowing on your own. I'm going to be pausing the recording in between speeches to do some analysis, and let's just get right into it.
Dyna affirms the benefits of the United States federal government's use of offensive cybersecurity operations outweigh the harm. Contention 1 is securing the United States. If the United States didn't use offensive cybersecurity operations, the U.S. would be forced into a defensive posture showing U.S. weakness. Lewis 16 of the CSIS writes that a purely defensive cyber posture cedes the initiative to the opponent and leaves the defender in a reactive posture, something no military should do. Fortunately, an offensive approach can deter and prevent attacks from occurring. Goldsmith 12 of Harvard University explains that if the U.S. detects a threat, the DoD can conduct operations that can stop them from happening by deterring foreign countries from attacking in the first place or preemptively attacking imminent cyber threats to take them offline. Critically, deterrence is key to prevent future cyber attacks. As Kugler 17 of the NDU writes, that major cyber attacks can be prevented through a cyber deterrence strategy that includes reassuring allies, dissuasion, readiness to respond, and the ability to project sufficient strength. Preventing a cyber attack saves the economy. As Pisani 18 of the CNBC contextualizes that a cyber attack against the United States could trigger the next financial crisis, concluding that cybersecurity threats have become the most important near-term threat to financial stability. A financial crisis bred out of U.S. economic decline would be disastrous, as Blanchard 13 of the IMF finds that the next global economic recession would push 900 million people into poverty. Contention 2 is counterterrorism. Currently, Trump is removing U.S. troops from foreign conflicts. Rasmussen 19 of the Wall Street Journal finds that Trump is pulling out most of these troops from northern Syria, leaving just a few hundred behind to protect oil fields. However, such military backout will bring consequences. As Kirkpatrick 19 of the New York Times finds that Trump's troop pullout removes the spearhead of the campaign to defeat ISIS, giving them their biggest win in more than 4 years. Critically, Vavra 19 of Cyberscoop confirms that without physical troops or drones, our only option to stop ISIS is offensive cyber operations because kinetic options are no longer available. Cyber operations prevent the rise of ISIS in 2 ways. First is blocking their media capabilities. Cyber offensives have already proven successful. Temple Raston 19 of NPR explains that JTF Ares, a unit of Cyber Command, was able to delete critical files, lock key ISIS leaders out of their accounts, and decrease recruitment, forcing ISIS's media capability to become a shadow of its former self. Indeed, Bates 17 of the American Security Project confirms that ISIS's international recruitment collapsed after U.S. OCOs broke down ISIS's capability for propaganda. Critically, Castleberry 19 of George Washington University explains that publicity and digital technologies are the lifeblood of terrorist groups, and since these assets are key to regrouping and planning physical attacks, media resurgence is a precursor to ISIS's physical revival. Second is by blocking financing. As Temple Raston continues that a key component of JTF Ares is to disrupt crucial financial links and banking options for ISIS. Critically, Duhaime 15 of the American Banker finds that ISIS relies on the banking systems of Syria and Iraq to fund their operations, concluding if the U.S. could effectively regulate banking systems, ISIS would not be able to rise to power. Overall, Rogers 18, the second commander of Cyber Command, finds that cyber operations have been key in removing ISIS from strategic geographical locations, helping to reduce ISIS's territory by 98%. The impact of containing ISIS is twofold. First is preserving Middle Eastern stability. Without OCOs, ISIS would be able to rise to power. The last time ISIS was in power, Jameson 16 of NBC finds that more than 18,000 civilians were killed and millions were displaced. Second is preventing grid collapse, as Bidea 15 on the Journal on Information Systems writes that terrorists so far have been prevented from having strong enough financing to launch a full-out cyber attack. However, with the requisite financial and human capital, they would be able to take down the grid. Unfortunately, Smith 14 for the Wall Street Journal writes that a coordinated cyber attack on the grid would likely collapse the entire U.S. power network, creating a blackout that would last at least 18 months. Catastrophically, CBN 18 finds that a cyber attack on electrical grids would be incredibly damaging, cutting off electricity that would leave millions of Americans without food, clean water, and access to healthcare, causing starvation, disease, and mass death, and thus he died on firms.
Okay, so let's talk about this case. The first contention here, I view this as a very preemptive argument. So when we think about the common topics common arguments on this topic. One of the most common neg arguments, and actually a form of the argument Blake reads, is essentially that U.S. offensive cyber operations escalate conflicts or lead to retaliation. So what this first contention essentially does is it preempts that argument by saying, yeah, maybe an offensive approach isn't the best, but a defensive approach is actually worse because it leaves the initiative to the enemy. That's this Lewis evidence and the Goldsmith evidence, which says that we can actually preemptively take out threats. So if we're reading an argument, the one that I just described on the neg about the U.S. Causing escalation, we need to be thinking about ways in which we can have a better link than this affirmative contention. We're probably going to read a similar impact about economic crisis if we're both impacting out to increase cyber attacks. So what we really need to do is just talk about how our link about escalation is better than this link about deterrence. And I think we can do this in a couple of ways. The first of which I love, is uniqueness. There's not a lot of uniqueness in this AF contention one. There is no argument about our cyber attacks going down or going up. That's probably because cyber attacks are actually going up, which probably proves that the current strategy of being very offensive doesn't work. Another way we can provide greater weight to our links is just by weighing things like probability, magnitude, historical examples. Those can all go a far way in helping to better link into the impact if this is sort of a preemptory argument. The second contention about counterterrorism, I think just based on the time Edina spent on this in case, you can tell that they probably want to go for this argument, and just based on like the impact being a lot bigger than just an economic impact. The way I see this argument best being beaten is by addressing the links. I don't think you can beat the uniqueness that well. Trump pulling out troops from Syria, that's probably just like true that troops are getting pulled out. There's going to be less troops than there was before. But I think there is a lot you can do on the links here. Specifically, I think one of the strongest arguments on this topic for the neg was just reading arguments about anti-American sentiment. Basically that like, yeah, U.S. offensive cyber operations might like shut down recruiting networks, might shut down financing in the short term, but in the long term, that U.S. and Western influence just causes more anti-American sentiment. In the long term, that causes more terrorist recruitment. And there's a lot of good weighing mechanisms you can do alongside of that. In addition to those turns, you should just be reading general like defense, like the U.S. offensive cyber operations aren't good at stopping recruiting and aren't good at stopping financing, or ISIS has found ways to get around our cyber operations. On the impact level, the first impact, 18,000 civilians killed, I think this is pretty easily outweighed. I mean, we'll see what the neg case is here, but I am guessing that it's going to be pretty easily outweighed. The second impact, though, I think is what Edina will likely go to. They basically say that terrorists could take down the U.S. power grid. There's a couple ways to approach this, and depending on what your case is, you might not want to address the impact directly, i.e. if you're reading like a power grid collapse argument on the neg, then you're not going to want to say, no, a power collapse wouldn't happen. It just gets into a similar scenario as I talked about before, where you just have to win the links, read reasons why your argument is more probable, why your links are stronger to the impact. Yeah, let's dive into the neg case.
Negate. Contention 1 is escalation with Russia. Russia is not a cyber risk right now, but they have the power to retaliate if provoked. Levine 18 writes that experts say that while Russia's grid attacks may seem aggressive, they have actually been comparatively restrained. Instead, Moscow seems to be signaling its capabilities. In the U.S. specifically, there has been talk of doing something against Russia. They want the option of doing something back. There are two reasons why Russia will escalate with the United States as a result of OCOs. The first is Western influence. Russia views U.S. cyber operations as undermining Russia. Churovich 19 contextualizes that the Kremlin cyber authorities hold an immutable view that the U.S. seeks to undermine Russia's position at every turn along the digital front, pointing to U.S. cyber operations behind global incidents that are unfavorable to Moscow's foreign policy goals. Russia thinks that Western influence as a result of OCOs is an existential threat, which leads to cyber escalation. Koschik et al. In 2018 explains that concern is widely shared by Russia, whose greatest fear is circulation of Western-influenced information. Even a minor violation of such harmony in a society supported by the control of information can quickly lead to escalation up the cyber action ladder.
Because Russia views the West as a threat, they will react to any U.S. aggression, which is proven empirically. As Lake in 2018 writes, there is the very real prospect of escalation. Russia already showed it was willing to go beyond previously established understandings of cyber warfare, and Putin can do worse. The second is miscalculation. Russia is likely to overreact to OCOs out of national security beliefs. Greenberg 19 explains that one very plausible miscalculation would be if U.S. Cyber Command were to penetrate Russian grid networks only to prepare the battlefield, but Russians misinterpret the intrusion as an immediate threat. In this scenario, Russia would be extremely likely to escalate because the U.S. has more to lose in a cyber war than Russia does. Greenberg continues that the U.S. economy and infrastructure is far more reliant on digitization and automation than Russia's, giving the Kremlin an inherent advantage in any future no-holds-barred cyber war. If you are doused in gasoline, don't start a match-throwing contest. The impact is the cyber energy sector. Russian hacking targets key U.S. infrastructure. As Smith in 2018 writes, the potential attack scenarios are becoming so dangerous that we can't wrap our brains around them. Russian government cyber actors target government entities and multiple U.S. critical infrastructure sectors, including energy, nuclear, and water. The impact is devastating. Connors in 2019 writes that successful attacks on a major position in the portion of the U.S. electric would have disruptive and deadly effects. Imagine a U.S. in which the internet would cease to operate. Food and clean water supplies dwindle and run out, and in such situations, a large number of deaths are likely and a societal breakdown can occur in as little as 1 week. This would cause significant damage to the U.S. economy. Reuters in 2015 explained that a cyber attack which shuts down parts of the United States power grid could cost as much as $1 trillion to the U.S. economy. This is crucial, as recession in the U.S. would spread throughout the world. Malden 18 indicates that U.S. recession will become a global recession as happened in 2008 because of economic linkages with the rest of the world. A recession will be devastating for those on the edge of poverty. As the IMF in 2013 terminalizes, over 900 million people are expected to remain vulnerable to being pushed back into poverty in the face of adverse shocks. Contention 2 is undermining nuclear deterrence. OCOs decrease certainty around nuclear deterrence. Lindsay 19 writes that cyber operations which rely on deception tend to undermine the stability of nuclear deterrence, which relies on transparency. Anything that contributes to information asymmetry is a potential source for bargaining failure and war. This increases the risk of conflict. As Lindsay furthers, the combination of cyber and nuclear capabilities may in effect constitute a doomsday device that might be triggered despite the wishes of the principal actors to avoid it. Given the high cost of nuclear war, every risk factor matters. A nuclear war with Russia would be disastrous. Acts 19 quantifies that a plausible escalating war between the United States and Russia would leave 90 million people dead within the first few hours. This terminalizes to extinction. As Lamb in 2008 warns, torrents of smoke ascend into the atmosphere to entomb the planet in billowing black clouds of ash. The result is plummeting temperatures and the death of life on planet Earth. That's communicate.
All right. So let's talk about this this case here. The first contention about escalation with Russia. This is sort of what I talked about earlier, with a lot of the neg arguments just being about escalation and a lot of the AF arguments just being about deterrence. I think it's smart for Blake to be reading a more nuanced, more specified view of escalation, i.e., if he died and just gets up and reads a bunch of general escalation arguments. Blake probably has front lines that are they're missing the view, they're missing the point of our argument. Ours is specific to Russia. So how is the debate gonna shape up between this first contention of pro about deterrence and preemption, and this second contention about escalation? The way this is going to get resolved is by who does better link comparison into their impacts. So the impacts are basically the same here. Crisis pushing 900 million people into poverty. It's the exact same. So it's just whoever can get a better link into that argument. So I talked about it earlier. I think one of the best ways to do this is uniqueness, especially for the neg in this debate, because offensive cyber operations and the number of attacks on the U.S. is probably increasing the status quo. But there's also other ways to do it, just through direct link comparison, probability weighing, magnitude weighing, preemption. Those are all important arguments. So, for example, a way for Blake to go about this is talking about probability weighing. No one really wants a worldwide recession, which is why the most likely scenario is probably a miscalculation on either side. That only happens in the neg world. A way for Dyna to go about this is, even if Russia wants to attack us, they don't have the ability to, because we preemptively attack their computers or their cyber threats, so they can't even launch a threat in the first place. So those are just two examples of ways that these teams can each try to resolve the link debate in their favor. Let's talk about the second contention about nuclear deterrence. It's very short, as you can probably tell, but the impact is really big. So when you hear these types of arguments, it's important not to get like freaked out just that the impact is so big. Whichever team is reading this still has to win the links in a substantive way in order to get the impact of extinction. Um, so just focus on addressing the links, turning the links. But if you're not reading an extinction scenario, it might not be, best for Edina to read probability weighing in this instance because they're also reading a lot of things about mass death. But one of the best ways to combat these extinction scenarios is just to read probability weighing and then probability meta weighing, i.e., we outweigh on probability for XXX reason, and then probability weighing is more important than magnitude for whatever reason. Maybe it's because in order for an impact to be big, it has to happen first, which is dictated by probability. So these cases both look good. I think a lot of the clash earlier in the debate might come down between the C1 of each side, because there's sort of that direct clash. Let's listen across.
So on your first contention about Russia, both of your warrants are reliant on like just a small infraction causing this escalation, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So when the U.S. put malware bombs in the Russian grid, why didn't this like escalation ladder happen?
It wasn't big enough.
We mean it wasn't big enough. We
It
have
wasn't
malware
an
bombs in their entire grid.
It wasn't
What
an
is
aggressive.
big enough?
It wasn't an aggressive enough attack. Are you referring to the June example, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what we did in June was we just got access to the networks. Russia just kicked us off in the next 2 days, and they
No.
didn't see us as that big.
We
of a
got
threat.
into the networks and then put malware bombs there. So what what event would be enough to cause the escalation if it hasn't
I'm
happened
pretty
already?
sure that we didn't put malware bombs in there, but the event that would happen is the United States does something for the for the actual purpose of sabotaging a Russian operation or a Russian function. But talk about your case.
Yeah.
So, on your second link in terrorism about
Mhm.
financing, right?
Yeah.
So you tell me that ISIS and terrorist organizations run their money through Syrian banks, right?
Yep.
Okay, so then if the United States uses an OCO to freeze financing, that means they're unilaterally hacking into other nations' banks without
No.
the other nation's consent, correct?
No. Our argument is that you prevent ISIS from even going through the bank in the first place. If
Why?
ISIS doesn't have access to their bank accounts, they can't use
Right,
their
okay, yeah. So you unilaterally, freeze the bank accounts.
Yeah, you
Without,
freeze ISIS's bank accounts.
Right.
You don't freeze the entire
yes,
Syrian
okay,
bank.
without the consent of the host country, correct?
We freeze ISIS's accounts,
Yeah.
not Syrian accounts.
Yes, without the consent of Syria, correct?
So, sure.
So how would Syria feel about that?
I would say that Syria isn't going to necessarily oppose it.
Okay, well, if
largely.
Syria thinks that's a good thing, why can't the U.S. just tell Syria to freeze the bank accounts themselves?
What do you mean?
You tell me that the U.S., in order to get the bank accounts frozen, has to do an OCO themselves, right? If Syria doesn't have a problem with freezing ISIS's bank accounts, then why can't the U.S. just ask Syria to freeze the bank accounts
Because
themselves?
Syria's main objective right now is focusing on their own conflict. It's not focusing on ISIS. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, let's go to your second link about miscalculation, right?
Yeah.
What type of an attack would cause Russia to miscalculate what we were doing?
The same kind of this is the same question as the last one you asked me.
I mean,
Let's go
it's
back to your case.
Can I just ask you about your scenario? Because it's just this nebulous thing that something in the future might cause this escalation. What is it?
You asked me the same question at the beginning of cross. I gave you an
And you
answer.
didn't-
I'm not going to do it again. Let's
You
talk
didn't
about
give
your
me an
case.
answer on what would actually cause it. If malware bombs didn't cause it, what
I said
will?
it would likely be an offensive cyber operation that is done to specifically inhibit or damage a
Why
Russian
is
operation.
taking down their entire grid not inhibiting
We
their
didn't
operation?
take down their entire.
We have the ability to, so clearly it's an
Having the
infraction.
ability to is different than actually doing it.
Okay,
We're
sure.
gonna move on. Let's talk about financing again, right?
Mhm.
So in order to freeze bank accounts, we need intelligence as to what banks the bank accounts are in and who's holding them, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this yeah, 5 seconds.
Okay, so I don't think that much happened that we need to talk about in first cross. It was pretty standard, but you can see each side is trying to set up arguments for their second speaker to make in rebuttal. So for Edina, that's asking questions about well, this happened in the summer. There was a big cyber attack in the summer, so why didn't that cause escalation? And then for Blake, it's just asking do you think Syria would like it if we unilaterally shut down bank accounts, sort of infringed on their sovereignty? So expect similar arguments to be made in rebuttal, and they're just obviously trying to set up their second speaker for rebuttal. I don't think anything else that interesting happened in first cross. Let's listen to first rebuttal. which I think is just probably going to go down the night case and hopefully has some weighing to help the first speaker get ahead.
We're good. Is it like long? Yeah, it's long.
So he's going to read a weighing under review, then I'm going to flow on the F case.
Start with an overview. Terrorism outweighs any impact on the round. Kagan 16 explains the rise of ISIS would cause the U.S. to overlook global objectives because ISIS stokes fear among Americans, and their attacks on the U.S. will shed light on other domestic issues, such as gun violence, making us turn inward. This has numerous implications for the round. First of all, we outweigh their escalation scenario on a Lincoln. Kagan concludes that the U.S. ignoring international conflicts will accelerate the collapse of the global international order and the economy, and thus leads to extinction. There are two implications. First of all, you can turn against them in the status quo. Escalation hasn't happened because countries fear international backlash. However, Kagan concludes that once the global order collapses, that rogue countries could proliferate and attack because there are no multilateral checks. But then second of all, turn it again, because without global trade, countries have no incentive to avoid war. Increases in escalation, that increases escalation in their world, whereas in our world, countries work together because they want to protect trade. But then second of all, we outweigh in magnitude. Kagan concludes that a collapse of the global order and the resulting escalation would cause extinction, which they don't impact you in their first contention, which means since their escalation scenario is constrained by international norms, backlash, and trade. Also, we outweigh in a Lincoln because the collapse of the global economy outweighs their tiny recession impact that they talk about on the economy impact. But then, third of all, we outweigh, and then this isn't relying on Kagan, it's just weighing independently, but we outweigh on probability because it's much more probable that ISIS attacks the grid than rational state actors. Graham 07 explains that the reason why their escalation scenario hasn't happened yet is because countries are constrained by international backlash and trade, specifically with Russia, who relies on trade with the EU. Conversely, Doffman from Case indicates that ISIS has no such constraints because they're extremely radicalized and thus aren't affected by international backlash. Thus, if ISIS were to get the capabilities to attack, it's much more probable that they would follow through than the actors in their case. This is really crucial because ultimately our case is going to come first because if a revival of ISIS happens, that means that they're going to definitely attack. But then, our contention one also outweighs for two reasons. First of all, on probability, they have zero precedent for escalation actually happening, whereas we explained that previously Iran has been actively deterred from conflict. But second of all, outweigh on a short circuit because their impact has never happened because OCUs deter the enemy and attack their capabilities, meaning that they neither have an incentive nor the ability to attack. With that, go to their contention 2, not their contention 1. First of all, their Lindsay card literally explains that Iran was deterred from attacking because of the fact that they knew that the United States could wipe them out with one strike. At that point, deterrence is clearly working, even if Lindsay later goes on to say that the OCOs are like super secretive. The reason why it works is because the fact that it's secretive, it deters Iran from attacking in the first place because they realize because they don't know the scope of the United States operations. But then second of all, the weighing from before applies because Russia doesn't want nuke war. The Graham card literally says that the probability is 0, but now in their contention 1 about Russia. First of all, in cross, they can see that, quote, a small infraction causes their impact. But what we would argue is that the June example already proves how there was a small infraction, yet their escalation scenario has not happened. It's been 4 months. Russia should have already escalated. But second of all, no one wants escalation. Jensen for the Washington Post in 2019 explains that using OCOs signals that you don't want escalation compared to conventional purposes. At that point, you can turn against them because OCOs de-escalate conflicts. Handler 19 for the Atlantic Council writes that OCOs are de-escalatory because using them signals that you don't want to go to war. It ensures that a diplomatic solution is reached. For example, in Iran earlier this year, Trump had the option of kinetic warfare but chose cyber in order to show Iran that he didn't want war. That's why Manis 18 for the Naval Postgraduate Institute explains that empirically, rival states are less likely to engage in cyber conflict because of the risk of escalation. For example, in Russia and the Ukraine conflict, none of the 2000 cyber events from 2013 and 2016 resulted in escalation. We outweigh the probability here because we have historical precedent of Russia actively exercising restraint. But then we turn their entire case because we set good norms to ensure peace. Fisher-Keller 18 for the Institute of Defense Analysis explains that constantly engaging with our enemies through the cyberspace helps create understandings between adversaries about what cyber action is acceptable. By increasing mutual understanding of potential threat, countries are less fearful of each other, decreasing the chance of miscalculation. Furthermore, by persistently engaging with our enemies, we can create better norms to ensure the future a future that is agreed upon by all, creating a safer future. There are 3 implications here. First of all, we outweigh in time frame, even if escalation starts initially. In the long run, countries understand each other's capabilities and adapt to them, de-escalating the conflict, which means that Russia is consoled. But then second of all, we link into their first contention because they're not going to be scared of Western influence at the point where they're literally creating norms with the United States. But then we also link into their second, that also answers their second link because it decreases mistrust between the two because they literally know each other's capabilities. And also, there's more impact defense here because Healy 19 for Columbia explains that an effective continued engagement is that it compels countries to shift their resources towards defense, which means that in the case of attack, we would still be insulated from it. That outweighs on a short circuit because even if escalation happens, we short circuit their impact because the attack won't even affect us very badly considering that we have such good defenses.
Oh, all right. Can I see?
Okay. So I think that rebuttal was slightly hard to flow with all the weighing overviews and like outweighing that was done on the AF case, but is against the neg. So let's talk about it. The first thing that they say is this big overview about how terrorism outweighs. This should make it very clear to Blake that Edina is planning on collapsing on their second contention, right? They're not going to read all of this stuff about how ISIS would cause the U.S. to look inward, which would cause the collapse of the global international order and economic systems, if they're not planning on going for it. That would be a big waste of like a minute of rebuttal time, which would be super inefficient. So when we're talking about rebuttal, obviously Blake still needs to address this first contention, but I think most of the emphasis should be put on the C2. So in the meat of this overview, Edina says that like the U.S. would ignore global objectives, which would cause the collapse of the international order, and would cause more escalation. I think the overview is very, in my mind, is very suspect. There's a lot of missing links, and I think it's like very unspecific as to what exactly is going to occur. So they say that the U.S. will look inward because like it brings up fears of like gun violence and things. I don't think that's ever happened before, despite like ISIS resurging. I don't think we really looked inwards to try and solve gun violence. And then there's all this stuff about how it would cause the collapse of the global economic order. I don't think there's like a single link read that says that like there's not a warrant in this argument as to why collapse of like U.S. hegemony leads to collapse of global trade and collapse of the economy. So I think that all these arguments about how just like without global trade, there's more escalation and we outweigh because the collapse of the economy outweighs recessions. I don't really think there's an argument like a single argument as to why that occurs, which makes it easier to respond to. Blake basically can just get up and be like, there's no reason why this happens. The economic order is much more stable than just like the decline of one world power. Then they read collapse of the global order causes extinction because the U.S. ignoring conflicts leads to escalation. Again, there's not really a warrant for this. There's not a warrant for why U.S. ignoring conflicts causes escalation. There's probably a lot of really good warrants as to why the U.S. getting involved in conflicts actually causes worse escalation. So those are great arguments to make with historical examples, i.e. the Middle East. Us getting involved probably didn't improve the situation. It actually probably made it worse. Like we killed Al-Qaeda, but then ISIS reformed and it's much worse than Al-Qaeda ever was. Then there's this probability weighing about ISIS attacking the grid. I think this makes sense, and this is kind of the link comparison weighing that I was talking about earlier. You have to read reasons why your link is a much more probable link into the impact, i.e. they're both reading arguments about like grid collapse. Essentially what Edina is saying here is that ISIS is not constrained by like mutually assured destruction because they're a terrorist organization, whereas Russia is. I think this is a really great argument. I hope that like they continue to talk about this more. It's an important weighing mechanism to win the meat of the argument. Then they make some more arguments about how their contention one outweighs on probability because there's no precedent for escalation, and the short circuit argument I made before that OCOs prevent attacks before they happen. These are both important things to respond to for Blake because essentially Edina could collapse to the C2 as like their main offense, but then could collapse to the C1 as like the main response to the opponent's case if they wanted to. So you have to address this short circuit argument that OCOs can prevent attacks before they occur. If you don't, then Edina just goes for a link that OCOs can detect and preempt attacks. That makes it impossible for us to ever get attacked. Okay, on the neg case, I think it's smart by Edina to not spend too long working on deterrence. I wish there would have been more I wish there would have been more offense because it's very easy for Blake to just kick out of all of this, and then it's basically a wasted 30 seconds. It doesn't give you a path to the ballot. These defensive arguments, they don't help you second half that much. If Blake just kicks out of them, which is I'm assuming what they're going to do here. So I would have liked to see some turns. They're great. They make your opponent respond more than just being like, we agree, the probability of nuke war is 0. So on the Russia argument, I think this is probably where Blake is going to end up going to as well. They talk about the first argument is that there's like a small infraction in June but no escalation. This is sort of what the first speaker from Edina was trying to set up in Crossfire if you paid attention. That's something you can do. If you're the first speaker in Cross, just try to set up your opponent. It adds more emphasis to the arguments, especially for lay judges. It's just like the more they hear it, the better. So setting it up in Cross can be really helpful. There's a lot of stuff about how OCOs are actually de-escalatory. I think Blake just has to respond. I think Blake can beat these arguments by being more specific than Edina can. None of these arguments really mention Russia. Um, I guess there's some arguments about like historical precedent, but I think Blake has some pretty good warrants as to why the Kremlin specifically sees U.S. influence as an existential threat, which probably addresses these like Handler and Jensen evidence. Then there's this argument about setting greater norms, which creates better understanding. I think the easiest way to respond to this, there's sort of a built-in front line in the Contention 1, which is this Lake evidence, which says that Russia doesn't really care about norms. They've shown they're willing to go beyond previously created understandings and willing to break norms to achieve their own goals. That kind of addresses all of these arguments about how, like, it will create better norms, because if Russia just keeps breaking them, then no norms are created. Then there's this argument about how continued engagement shifts resources to the defense. I don't think this is really they frame it as like impact defense and preemption, as like we'll get so strong at cyber defense that they can't attack us. I don't think this is really specific enough. There's nothing in this evidence about like protecting grids or like building up cyber defense to specifically protect our grid. I don't think it's that great of an argument. But let's listen to what Blake has to say. I think importantly is to not the second speaker from Blake has a lot to cover, but you can't spend too much on individual arguments. I wouldn't spend too long reading reasons why collapse of the U.S. doesn't collapse the economy, because there wasn't a warrant for Edina. So you just got to know, like, i.e. in this round, you have to kick out of your C2 fast if you're going to go for your C1. Just extend something like Russia doesn't want nuclear war. That means the probability is 0. Frontline all the turns on here, and then talk about the overview in an efficient manner. Like, don't pay too much attention to things that aren't warranted. Just point out that they're not warranted and read one argument, like one warrant why that won't happen, and you're going to be so far ahead that you can spend time on other things. So let's listen to what the Blake second speaker has to say.
Wait, 2 more seconds. Is everyone ready? Suddenly weighing over the taken evidence, they have to look inward. However, we would say that recession is the ultimate look inward. Maybe there's some sporadic terror attack, means there's some national security policy that gets encouraged. But there's a recession in the U.S. that means that all policy goes away from the rest of the globe and only towards fixing our own economy. We control the best link into looking inwards and collapsing the global order. Then the second problem here is that ISIS has been like operating for almost 10 years. Only this year is when they started to stop. That means that their argument is ahistorical. And so far as ISIS was there for 10 years and was ramping up and controlled almost all of Iraq and Syria, and yet this collapse never happened, but no hint of this collapse even happened empirically. Their argument is really, really silly. But then, let's go down further to our, contention 2. They basically say that, like, their first argument is basically that cyber operations signal low escalation. The problem here is that they don't interact with our specific warrants. Maybe generally cyber shows no escalation, but Russia specifically views U.S. OCOs as undermining its foreign policy. It's not about how, like, generally OCOs are a specific warrant to Russia. Their second argument is basically about how de-escalation leads to no conventional war. However, they are not proving to you that the alternative to this war is conventional. So there's no alternative to this. Russia certainly would not have the incentive to attack the U.S. if it weren't for the OCOs in the first place. They at best solve a problem they already create, but they're not even solving it anyway. But then their next response is basically about constantly engaging, and that solves for norms. There's a couple problems here, but I'll get to them later. The first one is basically that we actually set bad norms instead of good norms, and before we're attacking everyone, that's not a really good norm. But the second problem is that we would say that the Greenberg evidence answers back for this. That Russia fundamentally misunderstands what we are doing because they think that it could take other entire systems. Even if we think we're setting good norms, we're actually setting bad ones. But then they also basically make this argument about like probability, about how the grid was already attacked and nothing happened. However, what Reuters 19 finds is that Russia has uncovered in border attempts by the United States to carry out cyber attacks on the central systems of Russian infrastructure just days after we hacked them, meaning that they weren't really concerned about this hack. It's more that they could just kick us out instantly. Let's go to their case. On their C1, a bunch of turns. First turn, if the U.S. getting more involved in cyberspace normalized destructive attacks. Rule 19 finds is that exercising cyber warfare with the administration's eagerness to rely on digital weapons carries with it a great risk normalizing the militarization of cyberspace. Washington be lowering the bar for engaging in a new domain of warfare. We cannot play whack-a-mole with the entire world trying to strike down everyone's capability. If we use this capability, every other country is going to start using OCOs, meaning the long term is more conflict. But the second thing is it turned again because Iran actually retaliated with an offensive cyber, which gets where the tensions rise. But Subsequent 19 finds says that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security issued a special alert to an increasing number of cyber attacks from Iran to actually start targeting the U.S.-based businesses. That means that we control the best link as far as retaliation directly leads to like their answers. That we prefer us because we're actually giving you empirics. But the third thing is you can turn it again because preemptive offensive cyber leads to them being able to control our weapons. What Z15 finds is that Iran has learned from attacks like Stuxnet to improve its own capabilities. If we're just handing out weapons like willy-nilly, they're going to use them against us. Let's go to their contention 2 on terror. At the top, first turn it. OCOs lead ISIS to lead to more difficult networks to spy and which harm intelligence. What Bennett 16 finds is that an adversary quickly realizes the network has been compromised, cutting off the armaments, access to the intelligence, ramping up the offensive cyber campaign against ISIS will cause the militants to migrate to new communications channels. They literally tell you in crossfire this is a prerequisite to their finance argument. If we win, that intelligence goes down, we win this round automatically. But the second thing is turn it again because OCOs against ISIS undermine cooperation. The Nakashima 17 finds that when the CIA got wind of the operations, they became concerned that this campaign could undermine cooperation with those countries on law enforcement and counterterror. In the long term, we cannot keep up unilateral counterterror in places halfway away around the world. We need actual partners on the ground. They literally concede the link in this in crossfire. On propaganda, the Nakashima 17 finds that the reason why propaganda went down is because we killed all of their propagandists, so that's really, there's an alternate cause there. On the financing argument, first turn it because turning terrorists away from international financing declines our ability to track their funding. What Numa 17 finds is that de-risking has fueled a boom in informal financial services. It may risk from the West increasingly rely on informal money transfers. Driving terrorists away from the international financial system has inadvertently made it easier for them to move money around the world undetected. If we want intel on terrorists, you're not going to vote for them. But the second thing is that there's no link because terror campaigns don't require money anyway. When Numa 17 finds there's no evidence that is ever toward a cyber campaign. Most attacks require very little money and terrorists tend to use a wide range of money transfer and hacking systems. It's not just like a credit card. They get money in a lot of other ways.
Okay, let's talk about that speech. I think the speech is very, very good. I think it addresses everything that needs to be addressed in an efficient manner, and it leaves a lot of the burden on the round on the first speaker from Edina. So let's first talk about, obviously they're conceding the second contention about nuclear deterrence. Let's talk about how they frontline the arguments on their first contention. So they first respond to the escalation argument by basically just getting more specific. So this is what I talked about earlier. I think a great way to do that link comparison and to respond to these link terms is just explaining why you have better specificity. Their evidence says that Russia views undermine foreign policy as an existential threat. None of Edina's evidence really talks about Russia, so their link is just better in that instance. They address the other turns in a similar manner. I think the responses to setting good norms make sense, i.e. if we're attacking everyone, that's probably not a very good norm. Let's talk about how they addressed the overview. I think it's a creative way to address the overview. They don't address any of the arguments about collapse of the U.S. conflict leads to the economy. They more just address the argument that if the U.S. turns inward, that causes collapse of the U.S. global order. I think the first argument makes sense. U.S. recession is the ultimate way for us to look inward. Recession means all policy goes to the economy. I think that makes sense, and I think that's more historically true than what the AF is saying about ISIS leading to us us addressing gun violence, especially given the second argument from Blake that ISIS has been operating for 10 years and their argument isn't historical. I think that's an important weighing mechanism tacked on that just allows Blake to access all of the weighing in this overview in a better way than Edina does. So I think it's like a creative way to address the overview. If you don't think you can beat back all the links and the impacts, a simple way to try to beat back arguments like this is just do it better. We have a better link into this. A similar scenario is someone reads a lot of structural violence framing. Just explain why you have a bigger link into structural violence than they do. So let's talk about the AF's case. I think Blake does a great job of reading a lot of turns, and that's really what you want to be doing in this instance because it leaves so much for the first speaker from Edina to cover, i.e. if this had just all been defense, if the whole rebuttal had been defense, it's very easy to just ignore a minute of that, a minute of the speech, and then just talk about the second half. But since there's so many turns on the C1 and the C2, even if Edina wants to collapse on the C2, they're basically going to have to extend the entirety of the C1 anyway, just because they're going to have to address all these turns. I specifically like the analysis on Zeta. The U.S. weapons get stolen long term. That's a pretty easy prerequisite. We're just giving weapons to our opponents, which is a prerequisite because they can only attack us if we give them the tools to attack us. And on the second condition about counterterrorism, I think it all makes sense. It's sort of what was alluded to in First Cross that we lose cooperation with Middle East countries. I think there needs to be a little bit more implication on some of these arguments. First, for example, this Nakashima evidence, they basically just say that the CIA's concerned that there's not going to be cooperation with Middle East countries, but they don't. Blake doesn't really read evidence or warrants as to why we need to cooperate with Middle East countries. They just kind of assert that we need allies because like we're halfway across the world. I don't really think that's enough. I would have liked to see some more implication on that. So let's listen to Cross here, see what they talk about.
I'm not sure. It says, this is say earlier in the article about Iran and deterrence. I'm not sure. It says that Iran was actively deterred from pursuing cyber conflict because they realized.
The Sussman evidence answers back to this by telling you that Iran empirically escalated their
But the
cyber
thing
attacks.
is that the Sussman evidence is from June, the Lindsay evidence is from September. Iran clearly
But you're
learned its
talking
lesson.
about an incident in June, so I'm not sure.
No,
why you
we're
could say
talking
that
about a September incident.
That's two different incidents then. So I'm
Yeah,
not sure
they're
which
two different
one it
incidents.
is.
Ours is more recent because it shows that Iran understands now that there's a
Iran
deterrent.
didn't understand in June, but like didn't understand in September.
Yeah,
like,
because
they
it realized that the
like,
United States had the ability to literally take down its grid.
Didn't Iran always? Oh, wait, the U.S. has the ability to take down the Iranian grid.
Yeah.
I would
Or
love
at
to see
least,
that.
even if they're not, Iran's fearful of it, which is what Lindsay says.
Iran was fearful of it in June as well. I'm not sure what happened between June and September that would warrant.
Okay,
Iran to,
well,
like,
clearly
stand
something
by.
changed within the Iranian government which caused them to not escalate the conflict any further. You
I'm
can
gonna
have a
go
question.
question.
Go ahead.
All right, so let's talk basically about this, like, about the looking inward argument.
Mhm.
So ISIS was pretty big from like
Yeah.
I don't know 2010 to 2017. So why didn't we see any hint of the collapse of the global order?
We did. That's exactly what the Kagan evidence says, is that there are numerous examples of where the United States was looking inward and ignoring global conflict.
but
I'll give you a
I'm
few.
asking, yeah.
We overlooked the Crimea conflict. We didn't respond adequately,
We
which
didn't
allowed
respond
Russia
to
to take
Crimea
over
because of
Crimea.
ISIS? Is
We,
that the
no,
argument
no,
you're
it's that we
making?
were looking inward. We were only focusing on domestic policy. Another example, we let China expand the BRI.
Wait, I
We
wanna
let
talk
China
about-
expand
I
into
wanna
South
talk-
China Sea.
I want to talk about this Crimea argument first of all.
Okay,
right?
it's
You're
not. It
making
was
me-
just an example of how
Well,
the
you
U.S.
have
is
to be able to give me
overlooking
an
foreign
example that makes
conflicts.
sense, right? Like the U.S. in not stopping Russia in Crimea was because they were too busy dealing with San Bernardino attacks at
Low key, yeah. That's
Low
why.
key, yeah. Right. So maybe it's like they didn't want to get nuked by Russia and they didn't want to get in Putin's way. That would probably be like a more
Okay,
substantive
well,
point.
whatever. We still have like lots of other examples of it
Like
happening.
which ones?
Like when the United, like that's what led to the rise of Trump, right? Like there was more xenophobia
Trump
in the
was
United
because of
States.
ISIS?
Well, in part, yeah, it's because of the increased xenophobia that resulted from
Okay.
us dealing with
So
ISIS all the time.
Xenophobia came just from ISIS. Is that
Not
what you're
just
saying?
from ISIS, but what we're saying is that ISIS was an impetus to cause
What
increased
I'm
xenophobia in the
trying to
United States.
understand is
I don't understand why you're contesting that Islamophobia exists. Anyway,
I'm
can I have a
not
question?
not contesting whatsoever. I completely agree that Islamophobia exists.
Cool. So,
the
do
argument
you
I'm
wanna
making is that it's a thing that like
Okay.
some marginal increase in ISIS is not going to like suddenly change.
Okay, so let's talk about Russia real quick, right? So you say that Russia has a super strong incentive to attack, right?
I mean, they have a pretty strong percent, sure.
Okay, so then why haven't they escalated to a nuclear conflict yet?
Our argument is twofold. The first thing is that you're going to talk about like the June bridge stuff. The reason why that doesn't matter is because we didn't actually carry out an attack. We just got an
Ollie.
input, and they were able to kick it out after 2
Ollie,
days.
you're the one who read evidence in your rebuttal that said that Russia cared about the grid attacks in June and responded to it.
It kicked them
So
out
why
instantly.
didn't they respond
It
with
kicked-
greater
It kicked
force?
them out instantly. That they didn't have to respond. They could just kick them out.
No,
It
you
wasn't
were the one who
problem-
said that they increased cyber attacks in response to
No.
the June effect. Why didn't they do
That was
nuclear?
Iran. You're like conflating two different countries. Our argument is that Russia just kicked us out. Iran retaliated.
Okay, I don't think anything that really interesting happened in second class. Mostly, like, they're getting clarification on each other's arguments, asking about what evidence says. I think this next speech for Edina's first speaker is probably going to be the most important speech in the round. I think that's generally true, but especially in this round, there's so much to cover. But there's also a great way for Edina to get ahead of Blake through things like Wayne, through things like link comparison, and just generally first summary is a very powerful speech, but it's also really hard to get because you have to cover so much content. So let's see how he does, and then we can talk about it after the speech is done.
Starting
start in C1. They agree on three terms. First, they say that like it relies on like this argument that we set back north. The problem is that insofar as we win the persistent engagement is good argument, we win this argument too. But then their second response is that it increased escalation. The problem is that our argument for the Lindsay evidence is post-states theirs. Our argument is specific. When the U.S. did OCOs, even if they escalated in June, in September they learned their lesson, which is why deterrence worked in September. It prefer our evidence on recency. Then the third response says that like Iran actually responded and is able to respond to U.S. cyber attacks. Our argument is that there's no example of Iran actually adapting to U.S. cyber attacks. We would specifically say that Iran hasn't adapted, which is why specifically deterrence still works. On our contention 2 about counterterror, they read two terms at the top. First, they say that they're going to move to new communication. The problem is that in the past we've already killed the communication. The problem is the elaborate evidence gives the new one. Even if ISIS is able to research, we're going to follow them either way. So even if they try these new communication channels, they're going to stop it. Then their second response says that you can't do it unilaterally because it's going to like hurt our relations with other countries. The problem is it's literally the CIA saying it might be a concern. No country has literally come out, like ISIS or Iraq, has come out and said that like, oh, US, you can't do this. We would say relations aren't going down right now because Iraq and Syria still have an interest. It's just not their interest. It's not their biggest interest in the status quo. On our first warn about the media, which is the cleanest place to vote, they make this argument that like we already killed all their propaganda. The reason why we killed all the propaganda is because we destroyed the social media. Let's go to extensions. Our argument right now is that troops are pulling out. The Rasmussen evidence explains that Trump is pulling out all these troops from Rwanda and Syria, except for a few hundred. That's why the Badr evidence explains that OCRs are the only way to solve counterterror because we don't have these troops anymore. That's why we linked to the media order. The Temple Rasmussen evidence explains that when you have these media operations, it created a shadow of its former self. But 6 months after the opportunity, which is why the Bast evidence specifically says that it literally destroyed all ISIS propaganda. That links to our impact, our link about the Castleberry evidence. It specifically says that media resurgence is a precursor to physical revival because of communication and coordination, which means that if we win media, we win the ISIS link. That links into our impact on stability. The Jameson evidence goes untouched. It explains that 18,000 people are dying in millions last time the ISIS arise. Then go to the Wang overview. They don't adequately respond to the Kagan evidence. The first thing that they say is that recession is going to cause it. That's the problem. It only causes us to go inward temporarily. It literally lasts like 2 years. But the second argument that they make is that ISIS didn't cause it before. Arjun gives the example of like Crimea. It clearly shows that the U.S. is ignoring conflict. That's why you can extend the implication. We specifically tell you that escalation increases because the global order goes down, which means escalation, like their scenario, is only increase in their world because we don't solve terror. But the second piece of weighing that goes untouched is that ISIS is more likely to attack than Russia. The Graham evidence explains that Russia is never going to attack because they're relying on EU trade, but the Document evidence explains that ISIS is more likely to attack because they don't have any constraints. Go to their case. Their entire case is based on the advocacy that any small infraction is going to cause Russia to escalate. Don't let them get out of this because that's what they conceded in first cross. Their argument literally should have been triggered by the grid attack, but the second argument is the persistent engagement. The persistent engagement argument explains that countries are literally working together to prevent war. At that point, we would say that simply setting good norms and like understanding what is acceptable and is unacceptable prevents any type of miscalculation.
Do you want to see the
Alright, so let's talk about the speech. I think it's pretty good. I don't think it has enough on the Russia argument, and I don't think it does enough on the Wayne. So the first thing that the AF does is basically just it responds to the turns. I think it responds to them fine. I don't think the response to the role evidence is very good. It says it leads to the militarization of cyberspace. They basically just say if they win persistent engagement is good, then they win this too, but I don't think they're winning persistent engagement. I can talk about that once I get onto the neg side. I think the extensions on the AFC2 are good. I think they like extend the link and the impact clearly. I think they do a decent job responding to these first two turns, the Bennett and the Nakashima evidence. But I think the biggest issue is that they don't really address these. They don't address the turn of the financing argument. This turn that we've actually made it easier for them to move around money. I think Blake can extend this as just it's 100% dropped, and it's really good. It's a really good preemption onto the AF case because if our OCOs have made it so that we are unable to follow ISIS's money and therefore can't track the money, and then they can just like spend on whatever they want, that probably hurts our ability to fight them because they can buy really expensive weapons and they can pay people to do propaganda for them if we're unable to track their money. So that's just one way that you can address this. You can extend this conceded turn and then like blow it up in that way. When you're extending turns like this, it's not enough just to say like, hey, this was dropped. It says that we've made it easier for ISIS to move around money and to make money. You have to implicate it out as to why it addresses the contention writ large. some of the arguments that I made earlier. Obviously, it's going to be different because the topic you're debating right now is in offensive cyber operations. But it's a general idea that you still have to implicate out those turns. So we'll see if Blake and Summary goes for that. If not, I think it's fine because I don't really think the responses to this overview by Edina, like their extensions of the overview, are that great. They say that a recession is only temporary and it lasts a year. I don't think that's true, like, at all. And there's also no explanation for why a terror attack would make us look inward long term. Like, if anything, a recession is a more long-lasting event than a terrorist attack. So I guess we'll see what Blake says. And then they cite this example of Crimea, of us ignoring the conflict. There's not a warrant or, like, a piece of evidence as to, like, what about ISIS caused us to ignore Crimea. So I don't really think they're winning. I don't think they're winning cleanly at all, like, this argument. That's terrorist attacks are a better link into the U.S. looking inward than recession is. I think Blake is going to exploit that in the next speech very well to get access to all this weighing that Edina does about escalation increases without the U.S. Then they say that ISIS is more likely to attack than Russia. This is good. It's good probability weighing. I wish it would have been more fleshed out and more clear that they were weighing on probability. And it's also conceded. So, like, Edina should be pointing out that, hey, this probability weighing is conceded, which means you should look to our ISIS argument more than, like, when you're signing your ballot, you should look to ISIS before you look to Russia. On the neg C1, I think there needs to be a lot more arguments. This argument about, like, there was already an infraction should have happened is so, like, blippy that I would rather they just don't read that and just focus on explaining the warrant on setting good norms. They just say that, like, countries are working together to prevent war and they, like, understand what is acceptable. They don't address, like, any of the arguments that Blake has made in rebuttal, which makes it very easy for Blake to just extend a link and just say they didn't address any of our front lines. They can't extend through ink like that. So I really don't think Edina reads, like, anything substantive against Blake's C1 in summary. So we'll see, I guess, how Blake's summary speaker exploits that, and we can talk about it after.
On weighing, extend a lays prerequisite that says that like that economic recession focuses makes the United States focus inward because they're focused more on making their economy better and they don't really care about international retaliation. This goes conceded. Their only response to this is that the economy means you only focus. What? Their only response to this is that the economy only makes you focus inward temporarily. That's the same thing that's true with terrorism. They never proved to you that with terrorism you have to focus inward in the long term. You can always switch your policy up. At that point, both of us trigger the link into Kagan about focusing inward. Here's why they trigger it more than we do. Because when the economic collapse and the recession spreads to the rest of the world, not only is the U.S. forced to look inward, but all the rest of the other countries in the world are forced to look inward, like the EU. Which means not only do you lose U.S. counterterrorism operations, but you lose the counterterrorism operations, and the same effect happens that they say it happens to the U.S. to all the other countries in the rest of the world. That means there is a more inward looking when you vote for them. Moreover, you can also outweigh them on that means that we get access to other stuff. But moreover, we also outweigh on scope. We say that 900 million is a lot bigger than any terror impact. But they're going to read they terminalize it to whatever extinction activists. So let's talk about my case. We're going to the first link on contention one about Western influence. The Cherokee evidence says that Russia doesn't like Western influence or cyber operations because they're likely to undermine their political goals. The Koschik evidence says that they view this as an existential threat, which leads the Lane evidence to conclude that in response to any aggressive attack, they're going to respond with retaliation. They have a couple responses. First of all, they give the June example and say that since there was no retaliation there, that means our impact should have been triggered. They ignore the Reuters evidence from Malay and Rebuttal, which indicates that attack was not big enough. We didn't do anything when we got access to the grid. It only matters when we actually do something. We try to sabotage the Russian operation. That is the narrative of our case. Moreover, they try to extend the argument about setting good norms through persistent engagement. They also ignore Alay's frontlines that says, with the Grohl evidence, that those norms that we're setting with persistent engagement are bad norms. We are telling people that it's okay to continuously cyber attack each other. We're telling people that cyber war is okay. The alternative norm setting, if the U.S. didn't do OCOs, was setting the norm that no OCOs are used at all. So at that point, we're setting the norm that cyber operations are good, and that's a really bad thing. Moreover, let's talk about their case. There are a couple problems. The first thing is the Bennett term, which is really mishandled. We say that because you do OCOs on terrorist operations, that makes them more likely to switch the networks, so we lose all of their intelligence. They say that we can just follow ISIS to different networks. One, that means that every time they switch to a different network, we go back to square one on all the intelligence that we get because we lose intelligence every time they switch. But second of all, call for the evidence. It does not even say even close to the idea that we can follow them to different networks. At that point, that is the cleanest link into solving terrorism because they even concede in first cross. Their second link is reliant on intelligence. You can't do any counter-terror efforts if you have no intelligence, if you don't know where the terrorists are, and if you don't know what they're doing. That is way more important than disabling a couple media a little bit of media capabilities and kicking people off Facebook. If you don't know what the terrorists are doing, you have no idea how to actually stop them. But on the idea of destroying media capabilities, they mishandled the Nakashima evidence, which said that the reason that they don't have a propaganda machine is because we literally killed them. They say that that we destroyed the propaganda machine. That's not they say that that's because of social media. You can call for the card. No, so we literally shot the recruiters in the Middle East. That's the alternate cause. So their link doesn't really apply. Go. Is that a link?
Okay, I think that summary makes perfect sense for the round. I think it does enough to win Blake the round. I really think they're ahead after summary. I think Edina's biggest mistake is responding. Their Wayne overview, the way they frontline it was not very good at all. It's not substantive. They need better responses as to why a U.S. recession would not cause the U.S. to look inward, or why a terrorist attack would cause us to look inward more than a recession. So I think it's very new in second summary, but Blake does a good job of reading arguments as to why econ collapse, that effect of us looking inward is greater than the effect of a terrorist attack looking inward. Edina's argument that we only look temporarily with an economic recession is correctly pointed out that we also would only look inward temporarily for a terrorist attack, which allows Blake to get access to all of this weighing about escalation. And they also do this quick magnitude weighing about 900 million. It's really blippy. I don't think it's going to matter, but I wish they would have done more meta weighing. They're both reading conceded pieces of weighing that it's for Edine, it's this probability weighing that ISIS is more likely to attack than Russia, and for Blake it's this magnitude weighing that 900 million people is bigger than any terror attack. Those are kind of just two ships passing in the night. I wish there would have been more weight in comparison, but it's probably not going to matter because the way that Blake responds to this counterterrorism argument in summary is pretty good. The first Bennett turn, it's fine. I think this implication that you can't do counterterrorism without intelligence, I think that needs to be clear and needs to happen sooner. I didn't really understand in rebuttal why us losing intelligence was a prerequisite to the case. It makes sense after summary, but I think it should come out a little bit earlier. I do like the way that they frame it as a prerequisite. That's what you should be doing with all your turns, is implicating it out just like that. It's not enough to just extend the turn in frontline. Again, you have to implicate it out as to why it directly responds to their case. And I think Blake is right. Edina did kind of mishandle this Nakashima evidence that there's not recruiters because we killed them. I think there are better ways for Edina to respond than just saying we kill the social media accounts. ISIS can always get more recruiters, but they can't get more social media accounts if we shut them all down. That's an argument Edina probably should have made in summary. I think the responses on Blake's case are fine. The extensions are all fine. Edina basically didn't say anything substantive in summary, so it's a pretty easy extension. You just got to make sure you're responding to every single argument. It's easy, it's easy in second summary. You think first summary really messed up, and didn't read much on your case. One thing that I would always do is imagine the best way your opponent could extend the argument in the next speech and frontline that argument directly instead of leaving it up to chance. So instead of just saying there's not really a warrant for why they're working together, we're extending a warrant. We're extending cards that no, these norms are worse, instead of just more of a blippy response, similar to what Edina does. Just take the higher road, extend a warrant, even if what they said was a blip, basically. So yeah, basically my thoughts, Blake's summary was good enough to win them around. Edina's summary probably lost them around based on the responses to the weighing and not reading anything substantive on the Consi one. But let's see what happens in Grand Cross. Maybe Edina can bring it back in final.
Oh, you good? Yeah. Okay. So you literally extend this Lake evidence that says any infraction causes them to respond. So us going into the grid, even if we didn't do anything, is still an infraction, right?
You all extend to
all of our responses.
Okay,
The first one
yeah.
is that Russia was able to instantly kick us out, so there was no point in them
So
retaliating.
then why couldn't they do that in the future?
That's really new in Grand Crossfire, and we also see that like one specific attack is something they can always kick us out.
Okay,
Our
but you
warrants-
literally say,
also
okay,
carry
no, but what I'm
out
saying is that I'm
stronger
using your
attacks.
front lines against you because you say that it's an existential threat for them.
Sure.
So if it's such an existential threat and any OCO causes that, then why hasn't it happened
That's
since?
not what our argument is. Our argument is that they view offensive cyber operations that actually hurt their operations.
They
That's what our
literally
argument.
shut down their
Can I
grid.
finish? They did not shut down their grid. For the
They
record,
have the
they got access to the grid, and then 2 days later, promptly were kicked out. So I'm not sure why you're saying that we
You
shut
can,
down
no,
the grid.
you don't have to.
Reuters evidence is conceded, and it says that they literally kicked us out of the grid after 2 days. But the bigger problem is that y'all aren't answering the nuance of our argument. Our argument is not necessarily that any cyber operation against Russia triggers or impacts. Our argument is that any operation which they view as undermining their foreign policy goals, that's the Cherevich evidence, is what's going to trigger our
What is their
Evidence
foreign
never
policy
talks
goals?
about any specific, not like any little
Okay,
intervention.
sure, so what is their foreign policy?
I don't know. I mean, they have a ton of foreign policy goals. First of all, I don't know.
Why does that matter?
Would it be like maintaining stability?
Why does it matter what their foreign policy goals
Because it matters in terms of what their calculus
No,
is.
it matters for our argument that Russia sees us as undermining them. They can be whatever they want.
Sure, but
The
what are
thing
their
that
foreign
triggers
policy
the
goals
impact
that they
is
want?
The fact that Russia thinks
Okay,
that they're being
here's my
undermined.
question. Why do they care about us undermining them?
Because they don't
Because
want to be
everybody
undermined.
has foreign policy goals. Like,
Yeah,
if
so
you're-
what are
like,
those
if you're the
foreign
leader of
policy
a
goals?
country and you don't really care about your foreign policy goals being undermined, you're a pretty bad leader.
Would you say that one of Russia's foreign policy goals is to ensure that there is stability in the globe so that they can
That's
have
not I would say not really. Like Russia is like a pretty unstable.
So then why
actor.
haven't they attacked us yet?
They haven't attacked us because they haven't
done
felt
something big enough
undermined.
to provoke them. We haven't done an
Okay,
operation
basically
that
getting-
triggers.
Yeah, you can have a question.
Okay. Let's talk about your recruiting, the social media. Okay. So, my question is, does ISIS have a lot of propaganda, people who are ready to do propaganda right now?
Yeah, like anyone can post on social media. It's not like a big scale.
So we have to shut down every single ISIS person's social media.
No, they run their accounts out of 10 core ISIS media accounts.
10 core.
Out of 10 core accounts, exactly.
Sure.
When we did OCOs, we shut down all 10 accounts, which is why the vast evidence that you can see literally says that you collapsed all of ISIS's propaganda
So
after the
Does
operation.
it matter if there are accounts or not accounts if all the people who would be posting on those accounts are dead?
Other people can post on accounts, man.
No, our argument is that they have a propaganda team, which is what actually keeps their operation
Sure, the
afloat. If
propaganda
all of
team
them
will just be
died.
replaced.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
We'll run preps right now.
Okay, Grand Cross, nothing really happens ever. Same with this one, I don't think anything of substance happened. You could sort of tell Edina is behind when they start trying to make new arguments in Grand Cross. And if that ever happens, just make sure to quickly point out that it's new, and then address the argument. Let's see what Edina does in Final Focus here.
Their case winning our case. No, their case, our case winning. Sorry, your case, our case winning. On the persistent engagement turn, all they say is that the U.S. creates bad norms, but Ryan frontlines this in summary when he says that Russia and the United States and China will all be working together. The reason for this is because they want global stability. That is the Fisher-Keller evidence, which indicates that their foreign policy goal is to have a cyberspace that benefits all. The reason why persistent engagement works is really critical because once the United States does OCOs at a level that is a threshold below war, that ensures that countries can create norms because the cyberspace is constantly evolving. The only way that they can be sure of each other's capabilities is if they constantly attack each other at a minimal level. That is exactly why escalation hasn't happened yet, and that is exactly why our turnout is in a short circuit, because before escalation can even happen, those countries are, before escalation even happens, mistrust is decreased to the point where they don't even feel threatened anymore. But now let's go to our case. On our case, we explained with the Rasmussen evidence is that Trump is pulling out troops right now, which is exactly why Vavra concludes that without troops, the only way that you can curb ISIS is through OCOs. This goes cold conceded. We link in with our media warrant. The Temple Rasmussen evidence indicates that Operation Glowing Symphony in the past has empirically reduced ISIS media capabilities to the point where they literally had no return. That's really crucial because they were a shadow of their former self. That is crucial because the Castleberry evidence indicates that the only way that you can have a physical revival is that they have a media revival. And the reason for that is because they have recruitment, they need to have
have coordination. They talk about intelligence, but first of all, they provide no warrant. We provide a counter warrant about how OCOs increase intelligence because once you're seeing each other's vulnerabilities, you can see what ISIS's vulnerabilities are even more. But then second of all, we would say that empirics are literally on our side at the point where Temple Raskin concludes that despite the fact that even if there was decreased intelligence, we were still able to do the operation. That is really crucial because we link into our impact about 18,000 people dying. But even if you don't buy the impact about 18,000 people dying, we still link into the Kagan impact. They drop a very clear portion of Ryan's summary when he talks about how ISIS is more likely to attack. This is really crucial because the Graham evidence goes cold conceded that Russia is never going to do a nuclear attack because they have international checks and they care about international trade. Whereas the Doffman evidence indicates that if ISIS were to revive, that would cause a collapse of the global order because ISIS is literally so reckless that it doesn't even matter. At that point, that outweighs anything that they try to do on the Kagan impact because that would also lead to extinction. But even if you don't buy that, recessions are short-term, and whereas ISIS is a long-term threat, which means that our Kagan impact still applies there, which means that if there's not the United States hegemon anymore, that means that we're going to be, that means that we link into extinction and the collapse of the global order, which outweighs anything that they can do.
Okay, I think it's a good final focus based on the summary. It's a valiant effort, I think, to try to bring it back, but again, you can sort of tell Dinah is behind based on the new arguments that are being made, i.e., the responses to this Bennett evidence are basically all new in final focus. Not a single one of them is in summary. And then this, like, recessions are short-term, ISIS is so reckless it causes collapse of the global order, that's not really in summary. On the neg case, I think, again, he's trying to, like, they're trying their best. They're kind of trying to squeeze water out of stone here. I think they do a decent job explaining the warrant of, like, making sure there's global stability, but I don't think this part about, like, the Russia and the US and China are working together because they all want global stability. And, like, mistrust is decreased. That's not really, like, explained in summary. None of that is, like, implicated out in summary, so it's pretty new in final focus. And especially since Blake is speaking seconds, I think it's going to be very hard. It's very hard for judges to see that and then want to vote on that. It doesn't really make sense. The warrant's not that clear. And all this implication is all done in first final, not in summary. Yeah, I get, like, the thing is, Blake did drop this argument that, like, ISIS is more likely to attack, but Dinah also dropped the argument that 900 million people into poverty is bigger than a terror attack. So it's, again, like the thing I talked about after summary. The weighing is kind of just like two ships passing in the night. One side is like they dropped our probability weighing. The other side, they dropped our magnitude weighing. There's no comparison between those two weighing mechanisms, which is where I think meta weighing can really help clear it up. Let's see what Blake does in final focus.
Start on their case. They lose the round when they concede the Nakashima evidence about propaganda. What we tell you is the reason why the propaganda cannot function is because we literally killed all of their propaganda artists. That means that if they are even if they are able to, like, shut down the accounts and there's no one behind them to run them because we already shot them all or, like, drone strike them all, that means that they have no access to their impact. They have no link because they have no, like, there's no possibility that the ISIS propaganda arm resurges so far as they're literally all dead. But we're also winning the intelligence turn if we don't want to vote on conceded terminal defense. Here's why. We tell you that when we use our OCOs against the ISIS network, ISIS knows that we are there and is able to switch to a new network. They say we have no warrant. That is our warrant. They're misunderstanding it. Then they say that we're able to, like, follow them and we have intelligence on them. The problem is, that's our argument. We have intelligence in the status quo. When you vote for, when you keep up OCOs, that means you divert the intelligence away. You're not able to have the intelligence anymore, so they switch to a next network. They say empirics are on their side, but we would say there's a ton of other things that the US did against ISIS in the same time frame. It's impossible to evaluate empirics. That means that we win the prerequisite analysis. That in order to have a functional counter-terror operation, you need to have intelligence first, as they themselves tell you that we're winning the ISIS debate so cleanly. Let's go to our case. On the way, they can see that if a global recession happens, the entire world looks inward and not just the US, and eventually stronger linkage to the looking inward argument. They just say short-term, they just assert that you're going to go for the scope here. Then let's go to their turn on Fisher-Keller. They just say that, like, there's going to be a persistent engagement. The first problem is this is just a completely new implication in the final focus. The second problem is that we would say that there's not necessarily, not everyone has the same incentives for global stability. People will also want to launch cyber attacks against each other. That's what our goal evidence says. The third thing is we tell you that Russia's perception of OCOs is uniquely negative because it's about their foreign policy. Let's go to our link. The cherished evidence finds is that they view OCOs uniquely undermining their foreign policy. The caustic evidence, they view it as an existential threat, and the lake evidence that they're going to retaliate if they feel undermined. That means that we gain clean access to our link, that when they hack our grid, that plunges the US into a recession which spreads global. 900 million people get plunged into poverty. They say that, like, ISIS is more likely to attack us, but if ISIS does not have the money to attack us, they're never going to win this link anyway. But moreover, it's about nuclear weapons. We're talking about, like, the grid specifically.
Alrighty. I think, yeah, the final focus does enough to win the round for Blake. He's correct. Edina did drop the Nakashima evidence. That's a pretty big blunder to make, but I mean, they did kind of drop it in summary, so sometimes it's just better to ignore it. I don't think it's terminal defense like Blake is presenting it as, but there's no response to it, so I guess it just is terminal defense. The Bennett turn is also enough, I think. The prerequisite does kind of go conceded. There's not really that much responses to it. They just say that like OCO's increased intelligence, but that warranting is new in Final Focus. The Wayne, it's very, very messy. Blake in Final Focus says that the economic collapse causes everyone to look inward. I don't think there's a like implication of this. There's basically like they don't read an impact to that, but I don't think it matters because I don't think Edina is winning their case, and I think Blake is pretty clearly winning their case. The response that Edina goes for in Final Focus is a good attempt, but it's when you don't respond to any of the front lines in first summary, it's really hard to come back, especially if you're speaking first. But overall, I think it's a good round. I think it showed a lot of good fundamentals about like frontlining and link comparison. And there's also this Wayne argument, which is pretty interesting to hear. And it kind of shows you different ways you can beat back the Wayne. Instead of trying to address it all one by one, you can just do it better than them, i.e. economic recession causes the U.S. to look more inward than a terrorist attack does. And I think it's a good demonstration of implicating out turns and why that's important. So I hope you enjoyed this video.